Perhaps one of the most controversial sentences that we can hear in an encounter with another human being is, "God told me to do this," or "God told me that this is God's will." We all believe that God communicates with us in at least the most subtle, unconscious sensing of the whispering of the Holy Spirit, but it is really difficult for us to hear someone else say, "God told me." So first, perhaps, we need to think about the times when we have in one way or another heard God. I personally believe that God speaks through normal people in normal circumstances, in daily, mundane ways, far more often than God speaks, at least to me, through a full-blown vision. But it is just as important for us to honor the voice of God found in an unexpected card from a friend as it is to announce a miracle. Reach back into your memory and think about the times when you have been surprised by God speaking in your life. Maybe somebody was there just when you needed them and they had no idea that they were supposed to be there. They had no idea that you needed them and they had other plans. They just knew that they needed to come. Think about the times when you were compelled to do something, to speak out, to act, when you knew that doing so would bring down a lot of grief and extra work on you. Think about the times that you have been compelled to do something that you absolutely did not want to do. Did you hear the voice of God then? Think about the times when you were in crisis, when God told you that you were going to be okay. Maybe this message came through a prayer or through a bird alighting on a windowsill, through a beautiful open flower, or through a hug from a friend, or a smile from a child. Sometimes when we hear the voice of God, it's a little bit like a bad phone connection, or maybe when somebody calls you but you think they've got the wrong number, or somebody trying to shout across a windy field to us. We know that somebody is talking to us, but we can't understand exactly what it is that they want. Next year marks 60 years since the Montgomery bus boycott. You may know the story. Martin Luther King, the new pastor in town, was chosen by all the other pastors to mobilize a large-scale protest against segregation on the city bus system. And just as soon as the progress started, the death threats came rolling in. And one night, Reverend King came home to find his family asleep. He couldn't sleep, so he paced around the house, thinking and worrying about what could come next. And that's when the phone rang, and the voice on the other side of the line said, "Leave Montgomery immediately if you have no wish to die." In his memoirs, King said, "I was ready to give up. Sitting at the kitchen table with my cup of coffee untouched before me, I tried to think of a way to move out of the picture without appearing a coward. In this state of exhaustion, when my courage had all but gone, I decided to take my problem to God. With my head in my hands, I bowed at the kitchen table and prayed aloud. And the words that I spoke to God that midnight are still visible in my memory. I am here taking a stand for what I believe is right, but now I am afraid. The people are looking to me for leadership, and if I stand before them without strength and courage, they too will falter. I am at the end of my powers. I have nothing left. I have come to the point where I can't face it alone. And King remembers that at that moment he experienced the presence of the divine as he had never experienced God before. It seemed as though he could hear the quiet assurance of an inner voice saying, "Stand up for justice, stand up for truth, and God will be at your side forever." And he said, almost at once, my fears began to go. My uncertainty disappeared, and I was ready to face anything. Reverend King went to bed. He slept well. And he got up the next morning, and he went to work. And the next day, and when on the third day a bomb exploded outside of his house, he accepted the word of the bombing calmly, even though his family had been home, because his time with God had given him the strength to face anything with peace. Sometimes we as church don't do ourselves any favors. Sometimes we give ourselves the wrong impression of God. We all have the feeling that at one point or another, we might have been spoken to by God. We're not sure, though, and we are reluctant to share our experiences with others. But then, when we talk about the stories in the Bible, we get the idea that God was always having intimate conversations with those people. And yet, in our time, if you start talking to people about God talking to you, it's only a matter of time that somebody calls the men in white coats to come and get you. God promises us that God will always be with us, that God will never forsake us. But God does not promise that this presence is something that we can measure scientifically, something that we can print out and prove to other people. God's presence is subtle, and yet it's pervasive. A presence that, if we can hear the whispers through all of the little blessings around us, we can also hear the presence loudly in times of crisis, even though the times of crisis are the most difficult times for us to listen to anyone at all. Acts chapter 10 is not just about an epiphany for a man named Cornelius. Cornelius was a captain in the army that had invaded and conquered the land. And yet, the writer of Acts points out his prayerfulness and his faithfulness. Acts chapter 10 is not just about an epiphany for Peter. Peter was a great man doing great things for God. And Peter has a vision too, in which God tells him not to call unclean what God has called clean. For centuries, Peter and his people had followed the rules. And now God had flipped the script. And that's when Cornelius shows up, a person that the rules said was unclean to invite into Peter's home. And Peter was able to remember that God had flipped the script. Peter was able to remember what God said to him: "Do not call unclean what I have called clean." Peter remembered that it was not Peter's place to call Cornelius unclean. And so instead, Peter says, God shows no partiality. God has no favorites. Acts chapter 10 is not just a turning point for Cornelius or for Peter, but also it is a turning point for the church, which at this point began to open its doors to everyone, to Gentiles, with the message, our God loves everyone. We are all God's favorites. And when somebody walks into a faith community for the first time, they should see, it is my wish that they would see, a group of people who are so different from each other that it blows their mind. And they ask the question, what could it possibly be that these people have in common? Why are they all together? And then they would get an answer. Then they would hear that each of these people has had kitchen table moments. That we all, in one way or another, are doing our best to make time to hear the voice of God. That we all, with our weaknesses and strengths, try to understand what God is saying. And then, with all of the power in our tiny little bodies, we try to do the will of God as individuals and together as community and as church.